What happened? Well, let me tell you. I broke my back for 15 years down in the Texas oil fields, sending thousands of dollars every single month to my wife and kids back home in Pennsylvania. And when I finally returned, I found nothing. There was no new house, no car, no nice furniture, absolutely nothing. When I came back, the only thing I found was a profound disappointment because my wife had been cheating on me the whole time I was supporting them. My name is Louis Robert Harrison, and I'm 65 years old today. Maybe a lot of people think that at my age, everything should be calm, rest, and peace after so many years of work. But no, I'm carrying a story that weighs on my back like a sack full of rocks. I worked my soul to the bone in Texas for 15 years, sending money every month to my wife, Joanne, and my 2 kids, Bobby and little Joni. When I finally came back to Pennsylvania, there was no welcome party waiting for me. No family dinner with my kids, not even a clean bed. No, what was waiting for me was the greatest betrayal of my life. I was never a lazy man. I didn't like to be a drunk or a gambler. I worked hard. Down in Texas, I'd get up before the sun came out. Sometimes I wouldn't even have a proper breakfast, just some cold coffee and a stale piece of bread left over from the day before, and I'd head out to the construction site or the oil fields. In the blistering heat or the freezing cold, there I was, giving it my all. It was all because I had one single idea in my head, for my kids to live better than I did, for Joanne to not have to struggle, for them to have a beautiful house, to not have to borrow money, to not lack anything. Every month, no matter what, I sent money home. Some months I'd send $2,000, others $3,000, and when I had a good run on a project, I'd send as much as $5,000. And believe me, money doesn't just grow on trees down there. I broke my back, my hands were covered in blisters, and my feet would bleed inside my old work boots. But I felt happy because I'd tell myself, back in Pennsylvania, my family is living well, thanks to me. I dreamed of the day I'd return and see that big house with sturdy walls, a living room full of furniture, a room for each of my kids, and a piece of land where we could even have some chickens. Meanwhile, I lived on the bare minimum. I rented a tiny little room, a bed, and a small table where I kept my things barely fit inside. I never bought a car down there, never spent money on expensive clothes. What for? Everything was for them, and when I talked to Joanne on the phone, she'd tell me, "Yes, honey, everything is being saved up, don't you worry. We already bought a nice piece of land. We're putting up the new rooms. The kids are doing well in school. Everything's fine." I'd go to sleep peacefully, believing those words. Sometimes, when other guys from the crew would invite me to go out, I'd say no. They'd buy themselves big pickup trucks, go to parties, and even had other women on the side. Not me. I'd say, "No, I didn't come here to fool around or act crazy. I came here to work for my family." And just like that, time flew by. 15 years of my life, 15 Christmases, 15 birthdays that I spent all alone, just looking at the photos they'd send me, imagining that my money was doing something good back home. The day I turned 52, I decided it was time to go back. I said to myself, I've saved enough, I've sent enough. It's time to enjoy it with them, to be together. I remember taking the bus, crossing state lines, and feeling an excitement in my chest that I could barely contain. I cried thinking about hugging my kids, who were all grown up by now, thinking that we'd finally be a complete family again. I even imagined they might throw me a surprise party. But when I got to my hometown, the first thing I noticed felt strange. The house she had described to me so many times didn't exist. There was a building, but it was old, with peeling paint on the walls and a rusty gate. I thought I had the wrong address, but no. There was Joanne, standing in the doorway, looking at me with a startled expression, as if she wasn't expecting me. I dropped my bags on the ground and opened my arms to hug her, but she barely gave me a cold greeting, as if I were a distant neighbor. The kids, young adults now, just stared at me without any emotion, as if they didn't even recognize me. I felt a blow to my heart, but I told myself, they're probably just nervous. They haven't seen me in years. I walked into the house, and what I found was like a bucket of ice water to the face. There was no nice furniture, none of the things she had told me about over the phone. Everything was old, neglected, and dirty. The supposed new living room was just a room with broken plastic chairs. In that moment, I didn't understand anything. I asked about the money, about everything I had sent all those years, and Joanne just lowered her head. The worst part was when another man showed up, a guy named John Alexander, who owned the convenience store across the street. He walked in with confidence, as if the house was his. Joanne introduced him without a trace of shame, and right then, I understood that not only had they not saved my money, but she had been cheating on me for years. He looked me straight in the eye and said, "Well, thanks, buddy, for taking such good care of us all this time." I let out a nervous laugh, but inside, I felt my life crumbling around me. I didn't know whether to cry, to scream, or just to run away. I was standing in the middle of the house that was supposed to be my pride and joy, and the only thing I felt was shame. My wife, who I married when I was 20, the mother of my children, was now holding hands with another man, as if I had never existed. My kids, instead of running to hug me, looked at me as if I were a nuisance. I bit my lips to hold back the rage that was burning inside me. I tried to speak calmly, to ask them what had happened to everything I sent. I reminded them that every month I made enormous sacrifices, that I worked from sunup to sundown, and that every dollar I earned was for them. But instead of giving me explanations, they laughed at me. Bobby, the boy I used to hold in my arms when he was a baby, told me in a dry tone, "Look, old man, don't come here making demands. You're not a part of this family anymore. We've lived just fine without you, so you might as well just be on your way." I looked at him, unable to believe those words were coming out of his mouth. My daughter Joni, who I remembered as a sweet little girl who used to call me Daddy with such affection, also drove a knife into my heart. She blurted out, "You chose to leave. You abandoned us. Don't come here now playing the martyr." I felt the blood drain from my face. How could they talk like that when everything I did was for them? I gave them my youth, my strongest years, my effort, my sweat, and they, instead of thanking me, treated me like a stranger. While we argued, John Alexander just stood there with his arms crossed, a mocking smile on his face. I'd heard from neighbors on the street that this guy had a criminal record, but there he was, shamelessly standing in what was supposed to be my home. "Look, old man, you've got no place here anymore. You better grab your things and go before we kick you out," he told me. His tone was a clear threat. I stood frozen, not because I was scared, but because I was paralyzed by the pain. I wanted to believe it was all a big misunderstanding, that at any moment my kids would snap out of it, hug me, and tell me it was all a bad joke. But no, they either remained silent or threw phrases at me that broke me into pieces. I started walking through the rooms looking for even a single sign of what they had promised me. A purchased lot, a new room, a solid roof. There was nothing, not even decent clothes. Everything was old, as if abandoned. Then I understood that the money I sent for 15 years had been spent on fleeting luxuries, expensive clothes, parties, trips, whims. There was nothing to show for my sacrifice. My heart ached as if someone was squeezing it with their hand. I couldn't accept that the woman I had trusted with everything had made a fool of me in such a way. I wanted to approach her, to ask for at least one explanation, but Joanne looked at me coldly and said, "You're not my husband anymore. I'm living my life and you should live yours. You have nothing here." That sentence killed me more than any physical blow. I felt like I couldn't breathe. I, who had dreamed so many times of our reunion, who counted the days to come back and hold her, was now facing a strange woman who was kicking me out of my own home. The neighbors started to peek out of their windows. I could hear whispers from the street, the shame mixed with the anger. And as if that wasn't enough, John Alexander shoved me hard, making me stumble backward, almost falling. My children did nothing. They didn't defend me. On the contrary, they seemed to agree with him. That was the first real hit I took, not from a fist, but from betrayal. The people on the block were laughing. Some commented under their breath that I was a fool for trusting them. That day, for the first time in my life, I felt defeated. I, who had endured so much in Texas, couldn't bear being treated like this by my own family. I kept quiet, not because I agreed, but because I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing me cry. But inside, I was on fire. Every word, every taunt, every look of contempt was like a stab wound. When I finally went outside, I sat down on the curb, looking up at the cloudy sky. I didn't even have the strength to scream. I just thought about everything I had lost, about how my life had changed in an instant. And the worst part is that I understood that what I thought was a family no longer existed. It had died while I was working silently, far away from them. I couldn't sleep that night. I stayed sitting on the curb until exhaustion took over, but I didn't even close my eyes. I just stared at the ground like a fool, wondering what I had done wrong. The only thing that came to mind was the image of my children rejecting me. I remembered when they were little kids, when they would run to hug me and call me Daddy with so much love, and now they were cold adults who treated me like a stranger. My heart broke into pieces remembering that harsh transformation. The next day, I went back to try to talk to them again, because deep down, I wanted to believe that everything could be fixed. I thought maybe they were just angry, that perhaps with a few calm words we could sort things out. I knocked on the door, hoping they would receive me better, but what happened was even worse. Bobby opened the door, and the first thing he said was, "What are you doing here again? Get out of here, old man. You have nothing to do with us anymore." I felt a tremendous anger. I stood my ground at the door and said, "I am your father, and you're not going to kick me out just like that." Then John Alexander came out with a mocking smile and said, "Don't you get it, old man? I'm the one in charge here. If you don't leave, I'll drag you out." That guy not only stole my wife, but he also wanted to trample on my dignity. I replied that the house was mine because I had paid for it with my own sweat. Joanne, with all the nerve in the world, came out from behind him and yelled that I had no proof, that she had spent everything I sent however she wanted. The words hurt more than any punch. I tried to force my way in, but the three of them pushed me back outside. The neighbors watched from a distance. Some were laughing. Others murmured things like, "What a shame, poor Mr. Harrison. They really did him dirty." I felt like the world was collapsing on top of me. At that moment, Bobby threw a phrase at me that I'll never forget. "You should be grateful we're not calling the cops on you for abandonment. You're the one who left, and now you come back demanding things as if you're somebody." That sentence was like a knife wound. How could my own son, who never lacked for anything thanks to my work, say that to me? I felt rage and helplessness, but I still held back because something inside me told me not to lose control. Then, something happened that left me breathless. John Alexander threw a glass full of beer in my face and yelled, "Get out of here, you bum!" The people on the street laughed as if it were a show. I wiped my face with my hand, and although I wanted to lunge at him, I didn't. I stood still, with what little dignity I had left. In my heart, something broke in that instant. It wasn't sadness anymore. It wasn't just anger. It was a decision forming inside me. I wasn't going to put up with it any longer. I couldn't let them continue to humiliate me like that. Everything I gave, everything I sacrificed, couldn't end up as nothing. I walked away without a destination, my clothes soaked and my soul in pieces. I remembered every dollar I sent, every long day I worked, every sacrifice I made. I thought about how careful I was not to overspend, how I denied myself a good pair of shoes or a hot coffee because I preferred to send everything to them. And now I found that not only had they stolen my money, but they had also stolen my dignity. That afternoon, I sat in the town square. An older gentleman who had known me since I was young approached me and said, "Louis, I saw how hard you worked. I know you've always been a straight shooter. Don't let them get away with this. You have proof. You sent the money. Those people are going to pay." His words gave me a bit of strength, as if reminding me that I wasn't finished yet. At that moment, I thought about everything I had saved over the years. Receipts, papers, wire transfer records. Yes, I had them, tucked away in an old suitcase I brought with me. Maybe that was my way out, my only weapon to prove the truth. That idea got stuck in my mind. That night, as I tried to sleep in a small room a neighbor had lent me, I made a promise to myself. They were never going to trample on me again. I had already lost too many years, but I was still alive, and as long as I was breathing, I was not going to let them keep seeing me as a fool. The next day, I woke up with a pain in my chest that wouldn't even let me breathe. It wasn't a heart attack. It was the pent-up anger, the rage of feeling used and mocked. I walked through the streets of my hometown like a lost soul, and every time someone recognized me, they looked at me with either pity or scorn. Everyone already knew what had happened. Some would say, "Too bad, Louis, that's what happens when you trust too much." And others would just laugh behind my back. I had never felt so humiliated in my own town. In the afternoon, I decided to go back, not to beg, but to see just how far they were willing to go. As I got closer to the house, I heard loud music, laughter, and voices. It was as if they were celebrating my misfortune. I knocked on the door, but no one came. I pushed it open and walked in without permission, and there they were, Joanne, my kids, and John Alexander, drinking as if nothing was wrong. They looked at me with contempt, as if I were the intruder. I tried to talk to my kids again. I said, "Bobby, Joni, I'm your father. I gave you everything I had. How can you do this to me? How can you reject me?" But they didn't listen. My daughter stood up and yelled, "Just shut up, old man. You're nobody to us. You left, and we learned to live without you." Every word was a knife plunging into my heart. Bobby, with a coldness I had never seen in him before, added, "Stop coming here and making a fool of yourself. John Alexander's the man of the house now, not you. If you want to stay, it'll be as a guest, but don't come demanding anything because you have nothing." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My own son, for whom I bought notebooks and shoes, whose college I paid for with my hard work, was telling me that his mother's lover was now the owner of the house. I felt my blood boil. John Alexander stood in front of me and pushed me again, this time harder. I staggered, nearly fell, and he said with a taunt, "Look, old man, you're irrelevant here. If you don't get it the easy way, you'll get it the hard way." He showed me a knife tucked into his waistband as a warning. The neighbors who heard the commotion started to peek out. Some took out their phones to record. That moment was the last straw. They weren't just stealing my house and my family. They wanted to make me look like a coward, too. I bit my tongue to keep from hitting him, because I knew if I did, I'd be the one ending up in jail, not him. But inside, I made a decision. I wasn't going to put up with it anymore. I left there with my head down, but with my heart on fire. The public humiliation had made me stronger than ever. I was no longer the man who returned full of hope for a surprise party. Now I was a wounded, betrayed man who had nothing left to lose. As I walked, I remembered all the times Joanne had promised me she was saving the money. I remembered how my kids would ask for things and I'd send extra. I remembered them telling me they were building new rooms and buying furniture. It was all a lie. Every memory squeezed my chest tighter and tighter, but it also gave me strength. That night, I didn't look for a place to sleep in town. I went to a park and sat on a bench, looking at the stars. I felt defeated, yes, but I also felt that something inside me had awakened. I no longer wanted to beg them or for them to accept me. All I wanted was justice. At dawn, I went to a food stand, and a neighbor, a man who knew me from way back, bought me a coffee. He looked me in the eyes and said, "Louis, you're not alone. I saw you break your back down south. You sent money. We all knew it. Gather your papers. Get your receipts. Don't let them keep walking all over you. Those people took advantage of you, but you still have time to give them what they deserve." Those words were like gasoline on my soul. I stood up with determination. I remembered that in my suitcase, I had all the wire transfer receipts, saved carefully for years. Each paper was proof of my sacrifice. Each receipt was a testament to what I gave. I knew that with those, I could prove the truth. That day, I decided I wasn't going to cry anymore. I wasn't going to plead anymore. Now, I was going to fight, not with fists, but with proof. I had to show who I really was and everything I had done. I wasn't going to let them bury me alive. For a few days, I kept to myself, holding all the anger inside. It wasn't easy because every time I went out, I was met with heavy stares, with people laughing quietly, who surely thought I was a fool. It hurt. Of course it hurt. But I was no longer the same defeated man who arrived with illusions. Now I felt a strange strength pushing me to get back up. One afternoon, after gathering my courage, I went back near the house. I didn't want to go in, but I wanted to see with my own eyes what they were doing. From the outside, I could hear music and loud laughter. It wasn't a united family enjoying life. It was a group of people making fun of me, spending what wasn't theirs. Then Joanne appeared at the door, and without a shred of shame she yelled, "You again? I already told you have nothing here. You better leave before things get worse for you." I took a deep breath, approached slowly, and answered with a firm voice, "I'm not leaving, Joanne. I built this house with my money, and I have the proof to show it. I'm not going to stay quiet anymore." She laughed in my face and shot back, "And who's going to believe you? Everyone here knows you abandoned us." At that moment, I felt my blood catch fire. From behind her, John Alexander appeared with a cigarette in his mouth and a challenging look. "You're a stubborn old man," he said. "If you keep coming around, I'm going to mess you up. I already told you I'm in charge here. Joanne is mine, and so are your kids." Hearing that, my daughter came out of her room and added, "Dad, just get it. You have no place here. We feel sorry for you." That was the blow that broke me inside. Hearing my own daughter say she felt sorry for me was worse than any insult. I wanted to cry, but I held it back. Instead, I looked her in the eyes and said, "Honey, I worked my soul to the bone for you. Everything you wear, everything you ate, everything you studied was because of my work. And if you don't love me, that's fine, but you're not going to erase me as if I never existed." John Alexander pushed me hard, and this time I fell to the ground. The neighbors who were watching laughed. Some recorded with their phones. My face burned with shame, but also with a fire that was consuming me from within. I got up calmly, dusted myself off, and told them, "It's over. I'm not going to take any more of this. Get ready, because this isn't over." Joanne responded with a nervous laugh. "What are you going to do, Louis? You have nothing. You're a washed-up old man." But she didn't know that in my suitcase I had everything I needed to prove that I was anything but washed up. Every receipt for the money I sent, every wire transfer saved with a date and a name. It was all there. And although I hadn't shown it yet, I knew inside that the time had come to use it. I walked away from there with a firm step. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see them laughing. I walked straight to the house of a friend who had offered to help me. I told him what had happened, and he said, "Louis, don't let them do this. You have proof. You can prove everything. There are lawyers who can help you." That night, I sat down calmly. I took out my papers and reviewed them one by one. They were all there. Receipts, letters, transfer notes. I caressed them as if they were gold, because that's what they were to me, the only true wealth I had left. As I looked at them, I remembered every day I had worked down in Texas. I remembered my calloused hands, my torn boots, my aching back. Everything I suffered was reflected in those papers. And I thought, with this, I'm going to take them down. They're not going to keep seeing me as a fool. They're going to know who I am. I didn't sleep that night, but it wasn't out of sadness. It was from adrenaline. My heart was beating fast, as if I were starting a new chapter. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in control. I was no longer the humiliated man on the curb. Now I was a man with a plan, a man who had reached his limit. At dawn, I put on my clean shirt, tucked my papers into a folder, and walked out with determination. I didn't know exactly how, but I was going to find justice. It was no longer about getting the money back. It was about getting my dignity back. Once I decided not to stay silent, everything started to shift. The next morning, I went to a neighbor's house where he offered me a space to organize my papers. We pulled out the folder with wire transfer receipts, account numbers, and the letters where Joanne claimed everything was being saved. Seeing that proof hit me hard. Every page was the truth in ink. My neighbor introduced me to a friend from his church who knew a young lawyer who helped people with little money. We contacted the lawyer, and he agreed to see us. In his office, he received me without judgment and reviewed the documents. "You've got something here," he said. "This isn't just about money. It could be fraud." That word gave me strength. The lawyer explained the process. Take inventory of the evidence, gather witnesses, and file a civil lawsuit. He also suggested reporting the lover's illegal activities, given his criminal record. He mentioned key witnesses: the woman at the corner store who saw how they spent money, the clerk at the notary's office who knew about suspicious transactions, and neighbors who heard the arguments. Everything had to be in order. I left the office with a new folder and a will to fight. I started walking around town, looking for people who could testify. I went to the corner store and spoke with the woman who worked there. She told me she had seen John Alexander paying for clothes and gifts with cash. She gave me a written statement and said she wasn't afraid to tell the truth. That was a relief. I also talked to an older man who knew other laborers. He put me in touch with 2 other men who had sent money to their families in the same town and felt they had been deceived. They gave me their statements and agreed to testify. Suddenly, my case was no longer just mine. It was a pattern affecting several people. While we gathered testimonies, the lawyer investigated John Alexander. He found a record of fraud and assault charges. We got copies of the police reports and case files. Presenting that was key. It was no longer just the word of an old man against a woman and her lover. There were documents backing up my suspicions. Not everything was smooth sailing. The threats began. One night, as I was leaving a taco stand, 2 guys followed me and warned me to stop stirring things up. I didn't respond. The next day, we reported the threats. The lawyer said that would help prove they were trying to intimidate me. That gave me another piece of evidence for my case. The way people in town treated me began to change. Some looked at me with respect, others with doubt. But I didn't care anymore. I had allies in my fight. The neighbor who helped me, the lawyer, and the other men who had also suffered. Together, we mapped out a strategy. First, get all the statements, then file the lawsuit. And before that, share the story with local media so the community would know the truth. A journalist friend of the lawyer's showed interest. Preparing the media outreach was a risk. It could expose me to more humiliation, but it was also the only way to ensure no one could cover up what had happened. We planned which evidence to release first, the receipts, then the witness statements, and finally, John Alexander's criminal record. Everything had to tell a coherent story. I guarded my papers carefully as if they were jewels. Every receipt had its place. I couldn't lose anything. I started practicing how to speak in public, how to tell my truth without getting confused. It was difficult because the shame still hit me, but the shame transformed into strength. One afternoon, the journalist came to hear my story. He asked precise questions and took notes. He agreed to write a report if the evidence was solid. When he learned about the lover's criminal record, he became even more interested. I gave him copies of everything, and he promised to investigate. I felt that the story was no longer going to be just a neighborhood rumor. The next day, I continued to look for support. I spoke with a woman who worked at the notary's office, and she remembered strange movements in the family's paperwork. She agreed to testify about what she saw. Another young neighbor helped me gather videos and photos showing parties and shopping sprees, things that contrasted with the old house where I was now sleeping. We scanned and organized all of it. I felt a mix of exhaustion and relief. Every piece of proof was another step toward the truth. My heart was beating strong. As I started gathering papers and evidence, my mind also filled with old memories, the kind you keep like invisible scars. Every money transfer receipt I pulled from the folder took me back to a moment in my life in Texas. I'd see a receipt for $3,000 and remember the day I woke up with a fever, but still went to the construction site because I couldn't miss a day. I had to send that money. It didn't matter that my whole body ached. I remembered the times I had to sleep on a warehouse floor with a piece of cardboard for a mattress just to save a few more dollars. I remember one winter in Chicago when I worked in the snow with my hands numb and my fingers purple. That week, I barely ate anything but canned beans and hard tortillas a coworker gave me because I saved everything for the wire transfer for my kids. Now those memories came with a bitter taste because I realized that sacrifice didn't lead to the dream I had. I also remembered the phone calls with Joanne. I'd be so excited, asking her how the kids were, and she would answer in a sweet voice. "Everything's fine, honey. We're building up the house. We already bought furniture. The kids are studying. Don't worry." I believed her. It calmed me down and gave me more strength to keep going. Now it hurt to admit that those words were pure lies, that while I was breaking my back, she was laughing with another man. There were embarrassing moments I preferred to forget, but at the time, they pushed me to work harder. Like the time that, because I didn't have health insurance, I ended up treating a wound on my leg myself with alcohol and a dirty rag. It hurt so much that I cried, but I didn't want to spend money on a doctor because that money was meant for my family. I thought, it's worth suffering because they will live well. And now, remembering that made me angry. Another memory was of my birthdays spent in solitude. I'd buy myself a cheap little cake and put a candle in it. I'd sing to myself quietly and then make a wish that one day I would celebrate with my children. I always promised myself that next year I'd be back in Pennsylvania with them, but work always kept me. Now I think that maybe I should have returned sooner, even with less money, but I can't shake the feeling that they had planned to use me from the very beginning. The flashbacks came one after another. Like when a fellow worker told me, "Louis, don't be naive. Don't send so much money. Keep some for yourself, because they will just spend it all and you'll be left with nothing." I didn't listen to him, because in my heart, I trusted Joanne. Today I realized that man was right. Every memory filled me with rage, but it also made me stronger. I felt like I had no tears left, that now the only thing I had was the determination to show the truth. I didn't want revenge with fists. I wanted justice. I wanted the town to know who I really was and what I had done. I didn't care if Joanne ended up on the street or if John Alexander went to jail. What mattered to me was clearing my name so that my children would know, even if they didn't accept it, that their father was not a failure, that he had broken his back for them. One afternoon, while reviewing the receipts, a more painful memory came to me. The time my daughter asked for money for her Sweet 16 party. I sent her enough for a dress, a hall, music, and food. I worked double shifts that week. I barely slept. I felt happy because I thought, my daughter's going to have the party of her dreams. But when I returned years later, she didn't even look at me with affection. She just yelled at me that she felt sorry for me. That memory burned inside me. All those moments mixed in my head, and instead of bringing me down, they gave me more reasons to keep going. Every past humiliation became fuel for the fire I had inside. I no longer wanted to hide my pain. I wanted to use it to push myself forward. That night, while organizing the folders, I made another promise to myself. I would never let myself be humiliated again. Everything I suffered in silence, all the embarrassing memories, all the lonely nights, would now serve a purpose, to prove that I wasn't a washed-up old man, but a man who fought his whole life and deserved respect. The day they kicked me out of the house for good was one of the hardest of my life. I still thought I could talk calmly, that I could sit down with my kids and explain everything. I had the folder of evidence with me. I wanted to show them the receipts so they would understand that I hadn't failed them. I knocked on the door, hoping they would let me in, but the reality was different. Bobby came out with an annoyed look on his face. "What do you want now? We already told you have nothing here," I answered with a firm voice, though I was trembling inside. "I am your father, and I want to talk to you and your sister. I need you to listen to what I have to say." But he didn't even give me a chance. He pushed me and slammed the door in my face. I knocked again, harder this time, until Joanne came out. She was with John Alexander, who already looked like he was ready for a fight. "That's enough, Louis," Joanne yelled. "I'm telling you again, you're not my husband anymore. Go live your life somewhere else. You're in the way here." I asked her to listen to me, to give me at least 5 minutes, but she refused. Her lover intervened and said with that mocking voice of his, "Old man, if you don't leave, I'll have you thrown in jail. I know people who owe me favors. You want to end up behind bars?" My children came out from behind them, and the worst part was that they supported him. My daughter, the one I dreamed of hugging when I returned, said to me, "Dad, don't make any more scenes. Just go. We don't want to see you here anymore." I stood there frozen, speechless. I felt like my heart was being torn to pieces. The final push came from John Alexander. He grabbed my arm and dragged me out to the street, throwing my folder on the ground. The papers scattered, and the neighbors, instead of helping me, laughed. Some recorded with their phones, others gossiped loudly. It was as if my misfortune was a spectacle for them. I bent down to pick up my papers one by one, my hands shaking. Joanne yelled at me from the doorway, "Don't come back, Louis. Get used to it. You don't have a family here anymore." Every word was a knife in my back. I finished gathering my things while the laughter of the people burned in my ears. I had nowhere to sleep that night. I walked the streets until I sat down on a park bench. The wind was cold and I only had a thin jacket on. I closed my eyes, but I couldn't rest. I felt the biggest emptiness of my life. I was in my own hometown, and I felt like a stranger. I no longer had a wife. I no longer had children. I no longer had a house. At dawn, a stray dog came over and laid down next to me. That simple gesture made me cry. An animal was showing me more affection than my own family. I started thinking about everything I had done, about the years I spent in Texas, about how I dreamed of returning to hug them, and now I was alone, as if I had never existed. During the day, I sought refuge at a friend's house. He lent me a small room where I could leave my things. He offered me a plate of hot food and a place to sleep. That gesture gave me back a little bit of hope. At least someone still saw me as a human being. While I was resting, a neighbor told me he had heard rumors about John Alexander. They said the man was involved in shady business, that he had cheated more people, and that he had outstanding debts with the law. That ignited a spark in me. I wasn't completely defeated. There was a chance to turn the situation around. That night, I kept thinking about everything that had happened to me. I was at the lowest point in my life, but something inside me was beginning to change. I couldn't stay defeated. I had to get up, even with the little I had left, my papers, my dignity, and the truth of my story. After that night in the park and finding refuge at my friend's house, I started to see things differently. I couldn't keep crying over what I had lost because that was already gone. I had to adapt to where I was and figure out what to do with the little I had left. I would wake up early, walk through the town, and watch people. I listened to the gossip in the town square, saw who was hanging out with whom, and little by little, I began to understand that I wasn't alone in this. One day, while having breakfast at a food stand, a man who had also worked down south approached me. He told me that what happened to me had happened to him too. He sent money for many years, and when he returned, his wife had spent it all. We talked for a long time, and I discovered that there were several of us who had been deceived. That gave me courage, because I understood it wasn't just my story. It was the story of many. I also heard other neighbors speaking ill of John Alexander. They said the man had scammed several people with supposed business deals, that he would borrow money and never pay it back. Some accused him of starting fights in bars and threatening anyone who didn't obey him. Everything I heard was like another piece fitting into the puzzle. That guy was nothing more than a lucky criminal who had found an ally in my wife to bring me down. At night, I would review my papers. I'd lay them out on the table and organize them calmly. The bank receipts, Joanne's letters, the notes where she told me everything was being saved. Each sheet was like a brick for the wall I was building in silence. I felt like I wasn't lost anymore, that I was putting together something bigger than myself. Meanwhile, my friend helped me find contacts. He introduced me to a young lawyer who was eager to prove his worth. He listened to me patiently and said, "Mr. Harrison, your case is strong. You are not alone. We have ways to prove that these people took advantage of you." His words gave me back a bit of my dignity. I wasn't a washed-up old man. I was a man with proof and with the truth on my side. The lawyer asked me to find witnesses, so I started talking to the neighbors who knew me from before I left for Texas. Many remembered how I used to send money, how Joanne would brag about what she received. One woman told me she saw her coming home with shopping bags and that she always said, "This is thanks to my husband who works down south." That woman agreed to testify in my favor. Another neighbor said he had heard Joanne bragging several times about spending the money on parties. Little by little, I gathered voices that confirmed what I already knew. I also ran into a local journalist who became interested in my story. He told me it wasn't the first time he had heard of a case like this and that, if I wanted, he could help me make it public. I gave him copies of some receipts and he promised to investigate. I felt that the truth was starting to come out of the shadows. It wasn't easy, of course. There were days when the sadness would hit me hard again. I would remember my kids and wonder if they would ever understand what I did for them. I would think about Joanne, and it would hurt to imagine that she had shared my sacrifices with a man who wasn't even worth it. But every time those doubts tried to knock me down, I would grab my papers and look at them as a reminder. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't making anything up. It was all there, written in numbers and signatures. Adapting to this new life wasn't simple. I slept in a borrowed room, ate what I could, and wore what I had. But I no longer felt like a beggar, because I had a purpose. I was preparing something bigger than the pain. I was planning for justice. And even though they were still in the house, laughing at me, I knew that time was on my side. One afternoon, as I was walking through the square, I saw Joanne from a distance. She was arguing with John Alexander, and people were murmuring that things between them weren't going well. That moment made me smile. Maybe life was already starting to catch up with them. I promised myself not to give up. If I had already endured years of hard labor in Texas, I could endure this. The difference was that now I wasn't carrying sacks of cement. I was carrying the truth, and that was heavier, but also more valuable. The lawyer told me one day, "Mr. Harrison, you have the evidence. Now we need a strategy." Those words echoed in my head. Strategy. I had never thought my life would resemble a battle of paperwork and court hearings, but now it was my only way out. I sat down with him, and he explained step by step what we needed to do: organize receipts, find witnesses, gather John Alexander's criminal record, and prepare a solid lawsuit. That same afternoon, I started working with him. We classified each receipt by year, made copies, and put them in separate envelopes. We stored them in a box which the lawyer sealed so there would be no doubt. We also made a list of witnesses: the woman from the store, the neighbor who heard the arguments, and even a distant cousin who had seen Joanne showing off with money she had no way of earning. All of this formed a package they couldn't ignore. The plan began to take shape. First, we would file a civil lawsuit to recover what was mine, and then a criminal complaint against John Alexander for threats and fraud. Meanwhile, the journalist who was interested in my story started recording interviews. He asked me to speak on camera, and although I was embarrassed at first, I gathered my courage. I told my life story just as it was: the early mornings at construction sites, the money transfers, Joanne's promises. I didn't embellish anything. I spoke the truth. The report began to circulate in town and on social media. People no longer looked at me with just mockery. Now, some greeted me with respect and said, "Mr. Harrison, it's so unjust what they did to you." That gave me back something I thought I had lost: dignity. I didn't need pity. I needed them to recognize that I was not the one at fault. Meanwhile, John Alexander realized I was making moves. One night I ran into him on the street and he said in a low voice, "If you continue with this nonsense, you'll regret it." But this time, my legs didn't tremble. I looked him straight in the eye and replied, "You don't scare me anymore. Everything you say just helps me prove who you are." He fell silent, and although he tried to laugh, I saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. The lawyer also recommended that I speak with a notary to back up my evidence. I went to the office with all the receipts, and he made certified copies. Now, they weren't just simple papers stored in an old folder. They were legal documents that could be presented in court. I felt like I was finally building a wall against the lies. The plan also included seeking support from the community. The journalist prepared a larger piece with testimonies from other migrant workers who had gone through the same thing. When it was published, many in town began to question Joanne and her lover. They were no longer seen as the ones living well. Now they were pointed at as scammers. Every whisper on the street was a stone being thrown at them. It wasn't all easy. My children still didn't approach me. When I ran into them, they looked at me with contempt as if I were an enemy. That hurt me more than anything, because they were my blood. But I couldn't stop. I wasn't going to give up just to seek their affection. I had to keep going, even if they hated me. With the lawyer, we planned the first hearing. He explained that it would be difficult at first because they would deny everything, but if I held on, the evidence would speak for itself. He also told me I should be prepared for more threats, and he wasn't wrong. A few days later, someone left a piece of paper under my door that said, "Stop messing with things that aren't your business." I took it straight to the police. Every threat was another nail in John Alexander's coffin. The plan was in motion. There was no turning back. I was no longer the man sleeping on a park bench. Now I was a man with papers, with allies, and with a clear goal. Every step I took brought me closer to justice. That night, as I put my documents away again, I looked at myself in an old mirror in the borrowed room. I saw a tired, wrinkled face, but I also saw a man who didn't let himself be destroyed. And I said to myself in a low voice, "Now the real fight begins." The first serious confrontation with them came sooner than I expected. One afternoon, after leaving the lawyer's office, I decided to walk down the street where my house was. I didn't want to go in, but I wanted to look from a distance. However, they saw me almost immediately. John Alexander came out onto the sidewalk with that bully-like look he always had. "What are you doing here, old man? Don't you understand this isn't your house anymore?" he yelled. I stood my ground, took a deep breath, and calmly replied, "This house was built with my money, and sooner or later, I'm going to get it back. I'm not here to fight. I'm here to remind you that I'm not afraid of you." That just set him off more. He walked towards me, pushed me in the chest, and whispered in my ear, "If you don't leave, you're going to regret it." At that moment, Joanne and my kids came out. She, with that coldness I was now familiar with, yelled, "Louis, leave us alone. You're nothing to us anymore. What do you gain by coming here to provoke us? You're old. You can't win against us." My kids didn't say anything at first, but then Bobby threw out the phrase that burned me. "Dad, just stop. Live your life and forget about us." I just stared at them with a pain I can't describe, but instead of crying, I took out the folder I was carrying under my arm. I held it up in the air and said loudly so everyone could hear, "I have everything right here, receipts, proof, everything that shows who I am and what I did for you. I'm not staying quiet anymore, and if I have to go to court, I'll see you there." John Alexander let out a mocking laugh. "Court? No one's going to believe you, you crazy old man. Everyone here knows you abandoned your family." I looked him straight in the eye and responded, "Don't underestimate me. I'm not afraid of you anymore. Every word you say is just more proof of what you are." That confidence seemed to throw him off. I saw how, for the first time, his smile faded a little. The argument caught the attention of the neighbors. Several people came closer to see what was happening. Some already knew my story from the journalist's report and were murmuring things like, "That man has proof," or "The other guy is just a freeloader." The pressure started to build in the air. Joanne tried to shut them up by saying it was all a lie, but people weren't listening to her the same way anymore. Suddenly, John Alexander tried to punch me. He raised his fist, but a neighbor stopped him. "That's enough, man. Can't you see you're only digging yourself a deeper hole?" That moment was key, not just because I was saved from a beating, but because it became clear in front of everyone that he was the aggressive one. I picked up my papers from the ground and stood up straight with dignity. I looked at my children one more time and said, "I didn't come here to beg you. I came to show you that I'm not a failure, and when the day comes, you'll realize who was right." They looked down, unable to meet my gaze. John Alexander, furious, yelled at me as I walked away, "This isn't over. I'm going to destroy you." But it didn't affect me anymore. That threat was just empty air. I knew I was on the right path and that every step brought me closer to justice. That night I talked to the lawyer and told him what had happened. He smiled and said, "Mr. Harrison, this works in our favor. The more they threaten and assault you, the more proof we have that you're telling the truth." He was right. I was no longer the passive victim they could walk all over. Now I was a man with support, with evidence, and with people who were starting to believe in me. I went to sleep with a mix of exhaustion and satisfaction. I knew the confrontations were just beginning, that tougher days were ahead, but I also felt that I wasn't alone anymore. The community was watching, the lawyer was standing firm, and I had the truth on my side. After that confrontation on the street, things got tougher. John Alexander didn't stay quiet. On the contrary, he started using his connections to try to intimidate me. One morning, when I left the borrowed room where I was staying, I found graffiti on the wall with insults. It said I was a failure, that I had abandoned my family. I wasn't surprised. I knew it came from him or his people. What did hurt was seeing the neighbors reading the messages and some of them believing them. That same day, 2 police officers stopped me on the street. They said there was a complaint against me for harassment and that I had to report to the station. I didn't understand anything, but when I arrived, I realized that Joanne had made up a story that I was following and bothering her. It was an attempt to turn the situation against me. My lawyer arrived immediately and presented my papers. He explained that I was in a legal process against them and that these accusations were a form of harassment. The police let me go, but it became clear to me that they were going to play dirty. The threats didn't stop. One night, I heard footsteps outside my room, and when I went out, I found an envelope under the door. Inside was a handwritten note that said, "If you keep going with your papers, you're going to end up dumped on the highway." A shiver went down my spine, I won't deny it, but it also gave me more courage. The next day, we took it to the police and added it to the file. Everything they did just dug them into a deeper hole. Meanwhile, John Alexander continued to manipulate people. He said I was crazy, that I had made everything up, that I was just a bitter old man. He even tried to convince some neighbors that I had abandoned my kids for another woman in Texas. All lies. The sad part was seeing my own children repeat those words as if they were true. It hurt my soul to hear them say that I never loved them, when in reality, every sacrifice I made was for them. The lawyer told me, "Mr. Harrison, don't despair. They're going to try everything to bring you down, but the important thing is that you stay strong." And that's what I did. Every time I received a threat or an insult, I saved it as evidence. I didn't let myself be carried away by rage, even though I wanted to. The community began to divide. Some no longer believed Joanne and her lover. Others continued to support them because they still had the appearance of a respectable family. The journalist published a second story, this time with more evidence. It showed receipts, interviews with witnesses, and even a photo of me working in Texas that an old coworker had saved. That story was a tough blow for them. People could no longer turn a blind eye. That's when John Alexander tried to escalate things further. One afternoon, he came to where I was and confronted me in front of everyone. He yelled, "You ridiculous old man, stop tarnishing my name. If you keep this up, you'll end up worse off than us." I didn't move. I looked him straight in the eye and calmly replied, "You have no name to protect because you never had any dignity. I don't need to shout. My papers and my witnesses speak for themselves." The people nearby fell silent. Some even clapped. That was a moment I'll never forget. Of course, he didn't stay quiet. A few days later, he tried to file another complaint against me, this time for defamation. He claimed I was making things up to slander him, but the lawyer responded with official documents, his criminal record. That left him even weaker. People started to see him for what he was, a fraud. In the midst of all this conflict, my health began to suffer. I had headaches, sleepless nights, a racing heart. Sometimes I thought I wouldn't be able to take it. But every time I felt weak, I would grab one of the receipts I kept and read it. Seeing those numbers, those amounts I had sent month after month, gave me strength again. It was like reminding myself, it wasn't in vain. Here is the proof of your effort. The lawyer assured me that the hearing was approaching, that we were ready to face them in court. I prepared myself mentally every day, going over what I was going to say. It wasn't a pretty speech. It was my life, my truth, and I knew that when that moment came, nothing and no one was going to shut me up. The day everything started to come to light was a turning point in my life. The journalist who had been following my case published the full report on the local news and also uploaded it to social media. On the screen were my wire transfer receipts, the interviews with neighbors who testified about how Joanne bragged about spending the money, and even copies of John Alexander's criminal record. I watched it sitting in my friend's living room with a lump in my throat. I couldn't believe that after so much time in silence, my truth was finally being heard. The news spread like wildfire. In the town square, people no longer saw me as a fool. Now they looked at me with respect. Some would say, "Mr. Harrison, you have so much courage to report this, not everyone would dare." Others would pat me on the back and assure me they were on my side. That feeling was new to me. After so many days of ridicule and rejection, now there were eyes that recognized me as a victim and not a perpetrator. Meanwhile, Joanne and John Alexander began to feel the pressure. I was told that the day after the report, his store was empty. People no longer wanted to buy from him because they knew he was a thief. Even some neighbors who had previously defended him began to speak ill of him, saying they had always been suspicious of his sudden wealth. That was the first sign that things were changing. My children felt the shame too. Bobby wouldn't leave the house, and when he did, he walked quickly to avoid hearing people whispering behind his back. My daughter stopped greeting the friends she always used to hang out with because they were now pointing fingers at her. I wasn't happy to see them like this because deep down they were still my blood, but I understood that it was part of the consequences of their actions. One day, as I was walking through the square, I heard a group of young guys taunting John Alexander. They were shouting, "Freeloader and leech." He became furious and tried to hit them, but all he managed to do was get more people to record him with their phones. The videos circulated quickly, and soon the whole town saw him for what he was, a man with no dignity. Joanne didn't have it any better. She went to the store to buy on credit as she used to, and the owner kicked her out, saying, "We don't want thieves here." She left in tears, insulting everyone, but no one had any sympathy for her. What was once false respect was now pure contempt. She was left alone, without friends, without anyone to defend her. The journalist sought me out again. He told me the story had made an impact, that many migrant workers across the country had shared it. I received messages from men and women who told me, "The same thing happened to me. Thank you for speaking up." That gave me a sense of brotherhood. It was no longer just my fight. It was the voice of many who had been silenced. In parallel, the lawyer was preparing for the first hearing. But most importantly, the public exposure had already delivered the first punishment. Their reputation was destroyed. Where they once walked with their heads held high, they now walked hunched over. Where they were once seen as respectable people, they were now pointed at as traitors. One afternoon, I passed by the house and heard yelling. It was Joanne arguing with John Alexander. She was blaming him for losing everyone's respect, that no one wanted to give them credit or even talk to them anymore. He responded with insults, telling her it was her fault for letting herself be recorded and showing off what wasn't hers. The argument was so loud that the neighbors came out to watch. That scene confirmed to me that their world was collapsing from within. That night, I slept with a calmness I hadn't felt in a long time, not because I had won everything yet, but because for the first time I saw that justice could arrive even if slowly. People already knew the truth, and they could no longer hide. The next step would be bigger, the trial. But what was happening on the street, in people's eyes, in the whispers, was already a punishment in itself, and I felt it as a small victory, as the beginning of something much bigger that was yet to come. The day of the trial arrived, and from early in the morning the air felt heavy. I woke up with my heart racing, but also with a strange sense of calm. I knew I had done everything I could, that I hadn't just stood by. I put on my best shirt, the one I saved for special occasions, and with the folder of evidence under my arm, I walked to the courthouse accompanied by my lawyer. With every step, I felt like I was carrying the 15 years I worked in Texas, every dollar earned through sweat, every tear swallowed in solitude. When I arrived, I saw Joanne and John Alexander waiting. She was dressed in a suit that looked borrowed, her face hard, as if she had no shame. He had his usual mocking smile, but his eyes were tired. My children were behind them, their faces dull, as if the shame weighed more heavily on them than any word. For a moment, it hurt me to see them like that, but I quickly remembered everything I had suffered. The judge entered, and the hearing began. My lawyer spoke first and presented, one by one, the money transfer receipts. He explained how for 15 years I had sent consistent sums that amounted to a fortune. Then he called the witnesses, the woman from the store, the neighbor who heard the arguments, and even a former co-worker of mine from Texas who testified via video call. They all confirmed that I had fulfilled my duty, that I had worked, and that they were the ones who had failed. When it was Joanne's turn, she tried to deny everything. She said I had abandoned the family, that I never sent enough, and that the little she received was spent on food for the children. But the judge cut her off when my lawyer showed the receipts with exact amounts and dates. There was the proof. There was no way to hide it. John Alexander tried to defend himself by saying he had nothing to do with it, that he had only been with Joanne for a few years. But the lawyer pulled out copies of his criminal record, complaints of fraud and threats, and placed them on the table. The judge frowned and asked if he wanted to continue lying. The entire courtroom murmured, and some even laughed with contempt. His mask of a confident man fell apart in that instant. I remained silent for most of the time, but when I was given the chance to speak, I spoke from the heart. I said that I had gone to Texas not for pleasure, but out of necessity, that every day of my life there was a sacrifice, thinking of my children and my wife, that I trusted them, that I sent money with the hope of returning to a decent home, and all I received was betrayal. I didn't say it with hatred. I said it with the truth. The room was silent. Even my children lowered their heads. I looked at them and felt that even if they didn't ask for forgiveness, at least they knew in their hearts that I was telling the truth. The judge delivered the final word and declared that my evidence was conclusive. He said that the house and assets must be returned to my name and that the charges against John Alexander would proceed. Upon hearing this, Joanne burst into tears, screaming that it was unfair, that everything belonged to her. But no one paid her any mind. John Alexander lost control. He stood up furiously, slammed his fist on the table, and yelled that it was all a lie, that I had stolen from them. The bailiffs immediately detained him and escorted him out in handcuffs for disrupting the hearing. His face contorted with rage, his empty shouts, they were the perfect portrait of his downfall. That moment was the climax of everything. Years of sacrifice, of pain, of humiliation were summed up in an instant where justice spoke louder than lies. I took a deep breath and felt a huge weight finally lifted from my shoulders. When I left the courthouse, the townspeople were waiting for me. Some applauded, others patted me on the back. I wasn't looking for applause, but that gesture gave me back something I had lost: respect. I was no longer the abandoned old man. Now I was the man who stood up and fought for what was his. After the trial, everything changed. The house was put in my name, as it should have been all along. And that was the first real victory I had felt in many years. Not because the house was luxurious, on the contrary, it was old and neglected. But for me, it was the symbol of my hard work, the place where I could finally sleep without being kicked out or humiliated. I walked in slowly. I looked at the peeling walls and the rusty gate, and while many would have seen ruins, I saw my dignity recovered. John Alexander did not have the same luck. He was prosecuted for fraud and threats, and within a few weeks, he ended up in jail. The news was published in the local papers and became a topic of conversation in town. The man who once walked with his chest puffed out was now behind bars, facing loneliness and the contempt of everyone. The people who used to greet him now pointed him out as a criminal. His mocking laughter was silenced, and his fall was so loud that it's still talked about on street corners. Joanne was also scarred. Without her lover and without the easy money, she found herself alone. She tried to ask for help from the same people she used to show off to, but no one wanted to lend her a hand. She went from store to store looking for credit, and they all closed their doors on her. I saw her one day sitting on the curb with a lost look in her eyes, as if she had suddenly woken up from a dream she should never have had. That image pained me, because in the end, she was the woman with whom I shared my youth, but I understood that it was the result of her decisions. My children took a different path, weighed down by shame. They decided to leave for another state. I heard from neighbors that they saved up some money and went to try their luck elsewhere, fleeing from the judgment of the people. They never came to say goodbye. They never asked for my forgiveness, but I hold no grudge. They are my blood, and although they hurt me, maybe one day they will understand what happened. I don't expect anything. I just hope that life teaches them what I had to learn the hard way. I stayed in the house, alone but at peace. Every morning I would get up, sweep the yard, and cook something simple. Little by little I started fixing the walls, painting the rooms with my own hands as if to erase the traces of so much pain. I didn't need luxuries. I needed to feel that what I had was mine, earned with my sweat and not taken by anyone. One day I received a letter that surprised me. It was from an old co-worker from Texas. He told me he had read my story online and was inspired by me to speak up because he had also sent money and been deceived. He proposed that we team up to help other workers who had gone through the same thing. That letter moved me because I realized that my fight had not only helped me, but could also pave the way for others. That night, I sat in the yard with a coffee in my hand and looked at the starry sky. I remembered all the lonely nights I spent in Texas, all the times I cried thinking about my family. I remembered the pain of returning and feeling rejected, but I also remembered the moment I decided not to give up. That was the turning point. If I had stayed silent, they would still be laughing at me. But I spoke up, and with the truth in my hand, I managed to get justice. Now, at 65, I don't feel finished. On the contrary, I feel more alive than ever. I learned that family isn't always about blood, that sometimes the people who are supposed to care for you are the ones who hurt you the most. But I also learned that dignity is non-negotiable, that even if they knock you to the ground, if you get up with the truth, no one can keep you down. My story is not one of revenge. It's one of justice. They paid for their mistakes. One is in jail, the other in abandonment, and my children are in an exile of their own shame. I, on the other hand, recovered the only thing I wanted, peace in my heart and a roof over my head without feeling humiliated. As I walk through town and hear people greet me with respect, I know it was all worth it. They didn't give me back the 15 years I lost, but they gave me back something more important, the right to look at myself in the mirror and know that I am not a failure, that I am a man who got up after the harshest betrayal. And that, to me, is the greatest victory of all.